Thank you very much, David, and thank you all for turning up. The starting point for my lecture this evening is our present confusion over what anti-Semitism is. So I want to begin by showing you that when it comes to anti-Semitism, many of us literally don't know what we're talking about and are happy to admit it. And as for the rest of us who think we do know what anti-Semitism is, we are congenitally unable to agree among ourselves. We can get one measure of this if we look at a survey conducted by Populus in January 2015. This poll found that 45% of respondents were not confident that they could explain to someone else what anti-Semitism means. In younger groups, this figure rises dramatically. Among respondents aged between 18 and 34, more than 60% felt unable to explain what anti-Semitism is. If we move from a generality to a key particular issue, we find opinion not merely uncertain, but divided. A further survey undertaken by Populus in October of 2016 reveals wide disagreement regarding the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and, I quote, hatred of Israel. 48% of those surveyed were confident that hating Israel and questioning its right to exist is anti-Semitic. Which means, of course, that more than half of those questioned did not assent to this view. In fact, 20% of cases, respondents thought the opposite, that hating Israel and questioning its right to exist is not anti-Semitic. If we turn to opinion among Jews, we find even greater division. Consider the findings published less than 4 years ago by the Fundamental Rights Agency on the basis of research carried out by Jewish Policy Research and Ipsos Mori. The survey questioned whether Jews believed anti-Semitism is a problem in the United Kingdom. And you can see here that respondents were split on the issue. 48% reported that anti-Semitism is a fairly big problem or a very big problem. But a small majority said it is not a very big problem or not a problem at all. Given that all respondents were commenting on the same scene, which is to say they were commenting on the circumstances Jews encounter in the UK, we can only conclude that they held widely divergent opinions on what anti-Semitism is. In this lecture, I want to illumine our current uncertainty and division over anti-Semitism by examining what the term anti-Semitism has meant historically, from the time the word entered the English vocabulary down to the present moment. So let me be clear. The immediate focus of this lecture is not on the phenomena that we label anti-Semitism, but on the history of the concept of anti-Semitism. My main aim is to help us understand why we disagree so much and sometimes so fiercely. In doing so, I'm sharing with you preliminary findings and thoughts which emerge from a current research project. It is not only the findings that are new here, but the very subject itself breaks new ground. In this lecture, I will consider mostly, but not exclusively, what Jews have had to say about anti-Semitism, how they have characterized and analyzed it. Yet Jews, the targets of anti-Semitism, have not figured much in academic accounts of the subject. There has been some research on how Jewish representative bodies, in this country and in others, have responded to anti-Semitism, and scholars have also studied how individual Jews have responded to their travails. But we have not so far paid attention to what Jews have thought. what they have believed. We have not so far paid attention to what Jews have thought anti-Semitism is, what they have believed are its causes, and what, if anything, could be done about it. As we will see, the answers to these questions comprise an untold, sometimes surprising, and I hope instructive history. Having just trumpeted with shameless immodesty how original this lecture is, I want to acknowledge that in another sense it is not very original at all. I'm bringing to the study of anti-Semitism an approach employed by other scholars in the humanities working in other areas of inquiry. Over the last 3 decades, scholars in the humanities have begun to research and reflect on how the categories and concepts we use to understand society are themselves the products of history. We have asked how concepts and categories we take for granted, that are a part of our common sense, came into existence and how their meanings have changed over time. In this vein, scholars have excavated the changing meanings and uses of terms such as class, culture, and homosexuality. What is new in this lecture is that I extend this approach to the concept of anti-Semitism. In doing so, I take a particular approach to the history of these concepts. I attempt to follow Quentin Skinner's dictum that understanding a concept is always in part understanding how it has been used. Concepts do not, as it were, lie in aspic. They have been used to comprehend the world and to try to change it. Jews have been subject to legal discrimination, popular violence, religious vilification, and social exclusion, negative personal interactions, and stereotyped representations for millennia. Today, we are accustomed to gather all these phenomena within the single category of anti-Semitism. Indeed, the modern historiography of anti-Semitism has most often addressed what it calls its historic continuity as, I quote, the essence of the subject. In this way, we find events in medieval Europe joined categorically as well as chronologically to the history of the continent in the 20th century. And we find the history of Europe in the longue durée joined to the history of the Ottoman Empire and its successor states in the modern Middle East. All are expressions of a similar anti-Semitic outlook, we are told. Historians have gathered an assortment of acts and corralled them beneath the same heading, divining a unity across the diversity. We find this in the work of eminent scholars from Salo Baron to Shmuel Ettinger to Robert Wistrich. We find it too in the broadly held popular understanding of anti-Semitism as the longest hatred, a phrase derived from Wistrich's influential book of that title, and we find it in the well-worn metaphor used by Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks when he addressed the European Parliament in September 2016, when he said that anti-Semitism is a virus, forever mutating and finding new forms. Yet, it is only from the late 19th century that the term anti-Semitism came into existence. Among Jews, the new term had to compete with the time-honored Hebrew designation Sinat Yisrael, and also with another 19th century neologism, Judeophobia. In the rest of this lecture, I want to offer an account of how the term anti-Semitism came into common parlance in Britain, and equally important, how and why its meaning changed over time. In my concluding remarks, I will draw out some of the implications of this history. What I will say will focus primarily, but not exclusively, on this history as it developed among Jews in Britain. But as we shall see, this is not only a local history, but one that is part of international politics and transnational debates. We know very well that the terms Antisemiten and Antisemitismus were popularized in Germany in the last decades of the 19th century by journalists, academics, clerics, and politicians who argued that the Jews' civil and political equality, only decisively achieved in 1871, had been a grave error, and that the state should take action to protect Germans from Jews and Jewish influence. With great rapidity, the terms were taken up, not only by the self-acknowledged advocates of anti-Semitism, but also by Jews, their allies, and by commentators. And the terms were rapidly translated from German into other languages. We can bring this history into focus by examining the writing and political work of Lucian Wolff, the Anglo-Jewish journalist and lobbyist. Wolff provides a useful starting point because his particular and careful use of the term anti-Semitism alerts us to the importance of treating the term as a facet of political culture. Born in London in 1857, Wolff built a career as a journalist writing on diplomatic relations for the Daily Graphic. He was one of a cadre of intellectuals who lived by their pens and their wits, and who served and criticised British Jewry in these decades. He was extraordinarily well connected. His correspondence, most of which is held at YIVO in New York, comprises an extraordinary who's who of the British elite, from Lord Northcliffe to Ramsay MacDonald, and of the leaders of Jewry from Thessalonica to New York. From 1903, Wolff took a leading role in shaping and realising the lobbying activity of the Conjoint Foreign Committee, the patrician Anglo-Jewish communal body that aimed to influence British diplomacy and thereby assist Jews elsewhere in Europe who suffered from state-sponsored and popular persecution. The committee's greatest concern was the condition of the 5 million Jews living in the Russian Empire. The outbreak of war in 1914 placed Britain in a military alliance with Russia, and in doing so made the task of helping Jews in Russia impossible. Increasingly, Wolff directed his thinking and activity to the eventual peace and the opportunity it would give to ameliorate the status of Jews in Eastern Europe. At the Paris Peace Conference, he played a significant role in formulating the minorities treaties that aimed to guarantee Jews and other minorities rights of cultural autonomy, as well as political citizenship in the post-imperial states of Eastern Europe. In 1910, the celebrated 11th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica published its first ever entry on anti-Semitism, having commissioned Lucian Wolff to write it. The essay runs to 18,000 words and surveyed developments across Europe and stands as one of the first overviews of the subject in any language. According to Wolff, anti-Semitism was a recent development. It was not synonymous with all forms of Jew hatred through the ages. Repeatedly, Wolff connects the progress of anti-Semitism to opposition to the advance of industrial and commercial capitalism. He argued that persecution and seclusion in ghettos had placed Jews in the vanguard of the transition from feudalism. As a result, they had become practiced in commerce and devoted to democratic politics. Accordingly, Wolff connects the positive reception given to Wilhelm Marr's infamous 1873 pamphlet, The Way to the Victory of Germanism over Judaism, to the financial scandals and crash of that year. Similarly, he links the outburst of political anti-Semitism in Germany after 1879 to Bismarck's abandonment of the national liberals for what Wolff terms ultra-conservatives and Roman Catholics. This constituted not only a political shift, Wolff proposed, but a new alliance with agrarian capitalism that required the Chancellor to desert the bourgeoisie and the policy of free trade in favour of protectionism. Woolf therefore minimized the influence of Marr and other ideologues and propagandists who proudly declared themselves anti-Semites. Their writing became significant only when Woolf wrote it was submerged by the ignorant and superstitious voters who could not understand its scientific justification, but who were quite ready to declaim and riot against the Jewish bogey. In Woolf's view, the motor behind political anti-Semitism was a sort of false consciousness. We can see this where he ascribes the decline of anti-Semitism in Germany in the early 20th century to the dominance then of class antagonism in political life, as what he thought were real social conflicts eclipsed the fictions that fed anti-Semitism. The strength of the socialists had led, Woolf said, the new reactionaries to count on the support of the rich Jews and the strongly individualist Jewish middle class. In contrast to these new developments in Germany, Woolf argued that the murderous riots and incendiary outrages in Russia in 1881 were, I quote, essentially a medieval uprising animated by the religious fanaticism, gross superstition, and predatory instincts of a people still in the medieval stage of their development. In his public writings and in his private correspondence, Woolf eschewed the term anti-Semitism when discussing events in Russia. It was a designation he reserved for the new political movement at work in Germany. Of course, he understood very well that the pogroms were directed at Jews, but that did not mean they were anti-Semitic, according to his understanding of the concept. Three features of Woolf's understanding of anti-Semitism require special emphasis. First is his conviction that anti-Semitism is a modern phenomenon, which first emerged in the late 19th century. Although it interacted with medieval religious prejudices, he understood it to be something distinct from them. It was a political ideology inspired by nationalism, an attempt to reverse the social and political gains of emancipation and to exclude Jews from the public sphere and from German civil society. Second, because anti-Semitism was a symptom, Woolf thought, of the birth pains of modernity and of the triumph of the bourgeoisie in economic and political life, it was by no means the worst thing that could befall Jews. In 1912, Woolf assumed the editorship of a magazine called Darkest Russia, and his writing there underlines this point. The aim of the weekly was to reveal the Russian government as uniquely terrible and to demonstrate the miserable futility of the Duma and of other reforms in Russia. The word anti-Semitic and its analogues are largely absent from the pages of Darkest Russia. The legal disabilities and popular persecutions Jews faced in Russia are here presented as beyond parallel. Invoking anti-Semitism would have been counterproductive in this context, proposing a similarity of type, if not of severity, between the Jews' persecutions in Russia and the troubles they experienced elsewhere in Europe. A third significant feature of Woolf's analysis was that Jews could contribute to the spread of anti-Semitism. Since anti-Semitism expressed the erroneous view that Jews were members of a distinct race, whose interests were separate from those of their fellow citizens or subjects, anything which gave the impression that Jews claimed a nationality for themselves was likely to feed anti-Semitism. This was at the root of Woolf's opposition to political Zionism. In 1910, he dismissed the movement as, I quote, vitiated by the same errors that distinguish its anti-Semitic analogue. During the First World War, the problem posed by Zionism became particularly acute. He expressed his anxiety on this score in a letter to Zalman Devine. Here he warned, I quote, "To claim a Jewish nationality now would be to shipwreck all the rights we have gained in Western countries, and so far from helping our persecuted brethren in the East, we should involve the whole of Jewry in one great outburst of justified anti-Semitism." Wolff's understanding of anti-Semitism was not the only one in circulation. Some Jews, notably the religious Orthodox, found that the anti-Semitic movement in Germany and Austria was easily assimilated to the traditional Jewish notion of Sinat Yisrael, haters of Israel. They saw nothing new in the phenomenon. Nevertheless, Wolff's use of the term anti-Semitism was conventional at this time. Between 1880 and 1900, the Times referred only once to anti-Semitism in Russia out of a total of 231 references to anti-Semitism. Similarly, in 1912, the celebrated liberal jurist A.V. Dicey wrote a pamphlet that explicated and condemned the treatment of Jews in Russia without once using the term. Like Wolff, he found the systematic ill usage of the Tsar's subjects now finds no parallel in any other Christian state of the modern world. This approach extended to prominent Jewish writers in France, Germany, and Austria. In France, Bernard Lazare distinguished anti-Judaism from anti-Semitism, reserving anti-Semitism for our times, he wrote. Still more striking is the extent to which some early Zionists embraced this concept of anti-Semitism. Herzl regarded anti-Semitism as a novel development born of Jewish emancipation. Arthur Rupin, the German demographer who settled in Palestine in 1908, similarly proposed in 1913 the anti-Semitic movement grew up on German soil. It is almost as old as the enfranchisement of the Jews. In other words, it goes back as far as the 1870s. In Britain, too, Zionists saw anti-Semitism as a facet of modernity. Writing in 1916, in the volume Zionism and the Jewish Future, Harry Sacker and Albert Hyamson follow Wolff as they characterize anti-Semitism as essentially a modern phenomenon and the demagogy of reaction. The political problems faced by Jews in Europe changed substantially in the 2 decades that followed the outbreak of war in 1914. Most significantly, the progress of nationalism and mass politics in Eastern Europe brought popular antipathy to Jews into alliance with self-proclaimed modern political movements. This conjuncture fatally undermined the distinction Wolff and others had made between anti-Semitism as a modern phenomenon originating in Germany and the medieval prejudices of an ignorant East European populace manipulated by imperial rulers. The anti-Jewish boycott in Poland, declared in 1912 by the National Democrats, and particularly the violence it caused, disturbed Wolff's pattern of thinking even before the war. However, it was the collapse of 4 empires in 1917 and 1918 that provoked a substantial departure in the meaning given to the term anti-Semitism by Wolff and by many others. In the successor states in Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe, ethnic diversity after the First World War collided with majority nationalisms whose proponents often envisioned an ethnically homogeneous nation state. Jews and non-Jews gradually developed new conceptions of anti-Semitism as they confronted these new conditions. The status of Jews in the successor states was formally secured by a series of treaties that guaranteed them religious freedom, equality under the law, and some collective rights. These innovations, many hoped, would lead to a new era of cooperation between Jews and non-Jews. The largest of the successor states was Poland. Here, Ukrainians, Jews, Germans, and Belarusians comprised 1/3 of the population. Jews alone numbered 3 million and accounted for 12% of the total. In areas in which there were, I quote from the treaty, a considerable proportion of Polish nationals of other than Polish speech, so said the treaty signed in June 1919, Poland was required to establish primary schools with instruction in that minority's mother tongue. In the case of Jews, this meant, in theory, that the state should fund schools in which Yiddish or Hebrew would be the language of instruction. Yet, despite the new formal arrangements, Jews remained a disadvantaged minority. State funding for Jewish schools was not forthcoming. Obstacles were placed in the way of Jewish students seeking to enter Polish universities. There was a dearth of Jews employed by the Polish state. A compulsory Sunday closing law introduced in 1919 had a damaging effect on the livelihoods of observant Jews, and administrative regulations left thousands of Jews stateless. In Hungary, a new law passed in September 1920 placed limits on the numbers of Jews allowed to enter universities. In the case of Romania, Jews faced problems over the conferment of citizenship and access to university places. In Lithuania, an attempt to interfere with the autonomy of Jewish schools was blocked by the League of Nations, but Jews' economic position was weakened by a Sunday closing law. State-sponsored disadvantage ran alongside popular hostility and sometimes violence. At the same time as Lucien Wolff was writing to the Secretary General of the League of Nations, asking him to take action against the obstacles placed in the way of Jews who wanted to attend university in Hungary, he also received news that a new movement had led panic-stricken Jews to flee to Budapest for fear of pogroms. The future was not developing along the lines for which liberals such as Wolff had imagined and hoped. Legal, rhetorical, and physical attacks on Jews no longer seemed to reflect the teething problems of modernity or the vestiges of medievalism, but had acquired new vitality and took new forms in the democracies of Eastern Europe. The failure of the minority treaties to insulate Jews against popular hostility and institutional discrimination in the successor democratic nation states was vital in generating new understandings of anti-Semitism. Israel Cohen provides an illuminating illustration of this change. Born in Manchester in 1879, Cohen was a prolific author who wrote about the political and social conditions of Jewish life. In 1922, he was appointed General Secretary of the Zionist organization in London. As late as 1918, in his pamphlet on anti-Semitism in Germany, Cohen did not depart fundamentally from Wolff's conception of anti-Semitism. He characterized anti-Semitism as a new phenomenon dating from the last quarter of the 19th century and connected particularly to the reactionary attitude, in his words, of the German state. Even the pogroms in Poland in 1918-1919 did not provoke him to reassess his understanding of anti-Semitism. Having travelled to Poland to compile a report on the violence there, he ascribed the attacks in more than 130 towns and villages to short-term causes connected to the end of the war and, I quote, long-existing antagonism on the part of the Poles towards the Jews, arising partly from economic and partly from political causes. These were significant problems, but they were contingent, and given propitious economic and political conditions, they were not beyond amelioration. By the mid-1920s, Cohen viewed Eastern Europe with despair. Anti-Semitism no longer appeared a doomed vestige of former times, but seemed instead an integral and developing part of the contemporary world. In December 1925, he concluded miserably, anti-Semitism is an elemental instinct in Europe, all-pervasive and aggressive and protean in shape and constant in action, philosophic in theory, yet political in practice. It was now, he wrote, a dominating and irrepressible factor in Jewish life, a malevolent factor in Christian civilization. At the end of the 20s, he reflected, scarcely had the signatures become dry before various provisions of the minorities' treaties were violated in Poland, Romania, Hungary, Lithuania, and Greece. In the face of continuing discrimination and the apparent failures of the Polish Republic and the minorities' treaties to improve the situation of Jews, Cohen's hope for improvement had been replaced by pessimism and determinism. By the mid-1920s, even Lucian Wolff used the term anti-Semitic in the context of pogroms, and he no longer ascribed anti-Semitism to economic developments and political contingency. The Jewish question in Poland, he reflected in July 1925, was not a political problem, but a psychological problem. As they contemplated the rise of Nazism in Germany and Austria, Wolff's successors adopted the idea that anti-Semitism was enduring and deeply ingrained. In 1935, Neville Lasky visited Austria and Poland on behalf of the Board of Deputies of British Jews and the American Jewish Committee. He concluded, anti-Semitism in these countries is inherent and indigenous, ineradicable. Fatalism was noticeable elsewhere. Arthur Rupin, who we encountered a few minutes ago, now no longer regarded anti-Semitism as a product of the Jews' emancipation. In 1934, he employed the term anti-Semitism as a generic sign for, I quote, hatred of the Jews, and moved far beyond politics to encompass day-to-day social relations. In his book, The Jew in the Modern World, he asserted the phenomenon had existed ever since the beginning of the diaspora. Its origins lay deep in human nature. It was driven, I quote, by the group instinct, which, like the herd instinct of animals, welds men together, welds men who are connected by common descent, language and customs and interests into a harmonious community. The historian Louis Namier characteristically developed this argument to a logical and unsentimental conclusion. If the causes of anti-Semitism lay in human nature, he reasoned, then there was nothing necessarily and inherently wicked about it. It was simply that nations do not like each other and they dislike strangers in their midst. As Namier saw it, this only confirmed the necessity of the Zionist answer to the Jews' predicament. a notion that the wellspring of anti-Semitism lay beyond politics and deep in culture and society also underpins the writing of the Christian theologian and historian James Parks, the most prolific writer on anti-Semitism in Britain in the 1930s. Parks argued that the minorities treaties, even had they been enforced, would not, I quote, touch the roots of the disease. Initially, he found these roots in the First Crusade and what he described as the first outburst of popular persecution directed at Jews in Europe, which had been repeated in every century since. Yet further research led him to locate, I quote, the basic cause of anti-Semitism in the triumph of Christianity in Rome, which placed an intolerant minority, Jews, under an intolerant majority. In 1936, Parks was commissioned by the Board of Deputies of British Jews to research and write on aspects of anti-Semitism. The status accorded to Parks and the respect for his work provides a measure of the distance travelled since Lucien Wolff had published in the Encyclopaedia Britannica in 1910. For if we return to the three key features of Wolff's writing, its insistence on the modernity of anti-Semitism, the conviction that Jews faced worse problems, and that Jews themselves might stimulate anti-Jewish animus, we find that anti-Semitism was no longer conceived as a modern development, and that now it was acknowledged to be the greatest danger for Europe's Jews. All that remained was the notion, still held by Lasky, Parks, and many others, that bad behavior by Jews did contribute to the problem. So anti-Semitism, we've seen, was an invented term whose meaning changed over time. It did not address invented problems, however. It provided a flexible category that allowed Jews and non-Jews to make sense of and respond with varying degrees of success and failure to political challenges. It's also clear that objections to anti-Semitism invariably drew attention to a value or a project concerning Jewish rights that was being violated. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, anti-Semitism was identified with an assault on Jewish emancipation. This conception of anti-Semitism did not disappear in the interwar years. The victories of National Socialism in Germany and Austria illustrate its continuing relevance. However, the need to guard Jews' rights as individual citizens was supplemented after 1918 by defense of their collective rights in the successor states in Eastern Europe. The identification and denunciation of anti-Semitism between the wars was bound up with the political struggle undertaken to secure Jews their rights under the minorities treaties. As we have seen, it was not only the political project that changed, but also the characterization of anti-Semitism. Its dimensions and causes all underwent a process of expansion and transformation as writers responded to politics, but as they did so, drew on the new sciences of psychology or on historical research into the history of Christianity to explain anti-Semitism, as anti-Semitism was understood by some to be an outgrowth of human nature, and for others as a legacy of Christian civilization. And actually, as I was writing this passage this afternoon, it occurred to me how these systems of thought that came into place in the interwar period really bore a heavy legacy. If we think about the evidence that Salo Baron gave at the Eichmann trial, and then wrote up in a famous article which was published in Jewish Social Studies, he took the line that anti-Semitism was an outgrowth of human nature. It was dislike of the unlike, as he put it. The other path was taken by a historian such as Robert Wistrich, who really saw anti-Semitism as an outgrowth in Europe of the legacy of Christian civilization. In the decades after 1945, the meanings of anti-Semitism continued to accumulate as Jewish interests took shape within new political contexts. The campaigns made on behalf of Jews in the Soviet Union illustrate how objections to anti-Semitism continued to be yoked to rights claims. Now, however, these claims were framed by the Cold War and by the existence of the State of Israel, established in May 1948. From the early 1950s, activists in the Western Bloc, alarmed by the obstacles placed in the way of Jewish collective life in the Soviet Union, called for greater religious freedom, for cultural facilities for Jews, and for a program of emigration as a means to reunite families which had been separated by war. Initially, these campaigners focused on Jews' claims to enjoy equal civil rights within the Soviet Union, and they appealed to the Soviet Constitution. What is interesting in this respect is that Nachum Goldman, president of the World Jewish Congress, and others deliberately did not label the Soviet state anti-Semitic. By the late 1960s, however, a global coalition of Jewish representative leaders and activists did just that, and readily drew parallels between the suffering of Jews there and the victims of the Holocaust. Activists now insisted on a general right to emigrate. They invoked Article 13 of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which asserted that everyone has a right to leave a country, including their own. At the same time, many protesters now connected emigration to the right of Jews to return, I quote, to their historic homeland. In short, Soviet anti-Semitism came into view once Soviet policy was targeted in the name of universal human rights and Jewish national rights. We have seen that for more than a century, the concept of anti-Semitism was allied to the struggle of Jewish minorities for equal treatment within the states in which they lived. Aspects of this political effort continue to the present. Today, we cannot seriously imagine that the civil and political equality of the Jewish minority in the UK is under threat. Nevertheless, the negative images of Jews that were used over many decades to question that equality continue to circulate. By this, I mean, in particular, the idea that Jews are excessively fond of money, of power, and of their separate Jewish interests in ways that are unique, malign, and inimical to the common good. It's clear that neither the political left, nor right, nor centre have a monopoly on this sort of libel. In recent times, the spotlight has been on the left and the Labour Party, and it is at best unfortunate that some Labour Party members continue to find it hard to recognise and reject a libel. In addition to this continuity attached to the concept of anti-Semitism, there has also been a process of transformation. Today, the accusation of anti-Semitism in the UK tends to arise in the context of debate on the existence, policies, and practices of the State of Israel. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 marks a caesura in Jewish history. At the onset of the 20th century, political Zionism was but one political ideology among many that promised to save the Jewish people from anti-Semitism. Today, Zionism is hegemonic among Jews, and the Jewish state is a political reality, internationally acknowledged by the family of states and by international bodies. The concept of anti-Semitism has undergone a major alteration in meaning in the face of this revolution in Jewish history. When Israel is the subject of debate, the concept and charge of anti-Semitism is necessarily deployed in support of a state which defines itself as Jewish and in which Jews compose the majority of the population. Israel exercises sovereignty within its internationally recognized boundaries. Jews there as a collectivity enjoy the privileges and burdens of state power. In 2003, the Commission, headed by Israel's Supreme Court Justice Theodore Orr, reflected on the exercise of one significant aspect of these privileges. It concluded that the government's handling of the Arab sector has been primarily neglectful and discriminatory. In addition, of course, since 1967, Israel has also exercised dominion beyond its internationally recognized borders. What then has been the bearing of the creation and development of the State of Israel on the concept of anti-Semitism? The most up-to-date data on the attitudes of British Jews towards Israel, conducted at City University, suggests that 90% of Jews in Britain support Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. And British Jews widely regard the condemnation of Israel at the time of the last Gaza war as a reflection of double standards and, as I hope you can see, motivated by anti-Semitism. That was the third bar down. 70% of respondents perceived the motive for applying double standards to the judgment of Israel's actions as anti-Semitic. This view is endorsed vigorously both by Jewish communal leaders in this country and by political leaders in Israel. Israel's critics, of course, contest this conceptualization of anti-Semitism. They propose instead older conceptualizations which focus on the rights of Jews as a religious or diasporic minority. They also sometimes accuse the Israeli government and its supporters of bad faith. They suggest that the charge of anti-Semitism, when it is levelled in the context of debate on Israel, is a cynical ploy used tactically to deflect or disarm criticism of Israel. Their clear implication is that Israel's supporters have perpetrated a malign innovation by attaching a political agenda to the accusation of anti-Semitism, a concept, they imply, that was once untainted by any base political connection. But this claim is groundless because, as we have seen from the outset, the charge of anti-Semitism has been connected to a political program and was given meaning by a political program. Through the 20th century, the meanings attached to the charge of anti-Semitism have mutated and accumulated as the Jews' relationship to state power has also changed. The concept of anti-Semitism initially rested on universalist ideals as well as Jewish interests, upon the ideas of equality vested in Jewish emancipation and minority rights. This concept of anti-Semitism remains alive, as I've indicated. However, it has now been supplemented by a concept of anti-Semitism that is attached to a project of state building and to the protection of specifically Jewish interests. What is novel in the present moment is not the politicization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, but the relationship of Jews to state power. It's time for me to draw some conclusions from this survey of nearly 150 years of history. First, I hope I have shown that anti-Semitism is a concept, and like other concepts, it has a history. We can date when it came into existence, and I have tried to show something of its development. The shifting conceptualizations of anti-Semitism I have traced are the outcome of a history of political and ideological debate. In this light, we can see that any attempt to legislate for the correct use of anti-Semitism is necessarily ideological in character. Such definitions and attempts, definitions are attempts to impose themselves on politics and to assert a particular method of regulating relations between Jews and non-Jews. My second conclusion concerns the future of academic research in this subject. At the outset of this lecture, I drew attention to the commonplace view among scholars and the broad public that anti-Semitism is fundamentally a singular phenomenon, continuous across time and space. Very occasionally, historians have expressed skepticism about this view. Notably, the late historian Gavin Langmuir and David Engel have done so, and I've also tried to do so. All three of us have argued that the conventional view lumps together widely disparate phenomena. We have suggested that far from being the expression of a single anti-Semitic state of mind, hostility and aversion, discrimination and violence arise from widely disparate groups with varied aims. We have tried to contest the idea that there is a single anti-Semitism. In this lecture, I've tried to develop and bolster this argument by drawing attention to the way in which it was the historical contingencies in the interwar period that eventually led to this characterization and analysis of anti-Semitism as the longest hatred. David Engel suggests we abandon the concept of anti-Semitism as an organizing theme for historical research. But I hope I have demonstrated that there is at least one central aspect of the history of anti-Semitism that does remain for us to investigate, namely the history of how Jews have conceptualized and responded to the revulsion, antipathy, and discrimination they have faced. This will be a transnational history and one that would provide a new optic through which we can view the historical relationship between Jews and non-Jews. In this regard, work has barely begun, but I hope to have made a start this evening. Lastly, I want to provide a comment on the title of this lecture, The Meanings of Antisemitism. The changes in the concept of anti-Semitism I've traced here are connected to profound changes in the history of the Jews and their place in the world of states. It follows a long arc which reflects the emergence of Jews from statelessness and, in that sense, from powerlessness. Whereas Jews once campaigned for equality and strived to prove themselves worthy of it in states where they formed a minority, Jews now have a state of their own in which they enjoy and exercise privileges as the majority population. It is not surprising that the meanings of anti-Semitism have changed radically in response. The history of change that I've tried to set out and analyse can shed light on why there is now so much debate, bitterness, and confusion over definitions of anti-Semitism. Different meanings of the term have accumulated. The arrival of a new meaning does not eradicate old usages. The charge of anti-Semitism carries memories and knowledge of discrimination, violence, and genocide perpetrated against Jews. It can also be received with incomprehension when anti-Semitism, when the concept of anti-Semitism is yoked to identification with a state which, notwithstanding its many achievements, has a history that is widely seen to encompass discrimination and expropriation, occupation and annexation. The meanings that are sedimented within the word anti-Semitism thus form a barrier to constructive debate. As a result, in many cases, the charge of anti-Semitism is not a pathway, but a barrier to persuasive criticism of statements and actions which are offensive or nonsensical, or both. In this regard, the meanings borne by the concept of anti-Semitism not only carry the weight of history, but also continue to shape our present. Thank you for listening.